everyone, to the Social Science Forum for tonight. And I'd like to introduce our speaker. I met James Jones about 10 years ago at bioethics summer camp, where we all sat around a lake, and I just got the opportunity to sit and listen to him tell stories. And it was, I think, another historian who was there who said, "Did you know, by the way, that Jim Jones is the author of Bad Blood, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiments?" And of course, this book is one of the seminal works in bioethics before there was even a field of bioethics. And so it is my great pleasure to be able to introduce to you today James Jones, the author of Bad Blood, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiments. He is the Distinguished Alumni Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Arkansas. He was the Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Houston during the 1980s and 90s. Dr. Jones received his PhD in American Social and Intellectual History from Indiana University. He has held a fellowship from the Grant Foundation, the National Institute of Mental Health, Harvard University, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Dr. Jones is the author of Bad Blood, and this book received the Arthur Whistleblower Award from the American Public Health Association, and was selected by the editors of the New York Times Book Review as one of the 12 best books published in 1981. Bad Blood became a bioethics classic, and the Tuskegee experiment a landmark case that shaped the current regulatory framework, and that's for all research in the United States. Jones' second book, Alfred C. Kinsey, A Public-Private Life, was one of 2 finalists for the Pulitzer Prize in Biography. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but there's a recent film that is somewhat related to his book on Kinsey, influenced very much so by his book. His articles and book reviews have appeared in publications as diverse as The New Yorker and the Hastings Report, which is a bioethics journal. He has appeared on Good Morning America and The Today Show. His non-academic passions are baseball and fishing, and Dr. Jones lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Linda Ours. And do you still have the toy poodle?
We do.
Toby. I've met Toby. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jones.
Hello. I'm very happy to be back here. I've visited your campus on one previous occasion, and it's always a joy to come back, so thank you. Tuskegee is a sort of peculiarly American story. I don't see it happening in many other places. It has too many of the trace marks of our culture. The bare bones of the study are that beginning in 1932, the United States Public Health Service conducted a scientific study of the effects of untreated syphilis on a group of African Americans who lived in and around Tuskegee, Alabama. But it drew upon the hinterland. So you had people in communities outside Tuskegee. You had people in the contiguous counties, Russell County, Bullock County, Tallapoosa County, that rich area of the Black Belt in Alabama, about 35 miles from Montgomery. The experiment lasted until 1972, so you can tick them off. 4 decades, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, it goes into the 70s. It was the longest non-therapeutic experiment in medical history. Over the course of that experiment, men in the study, and there were more than 420 syphilitics. There were approximately 200 controls, men who didn't have the disease. Scores of those men die, and they die as a direct consequence of their infection from syphilis. The burden for any scholar is to say, okay, how does that happen in my country? How does that happen in the US? It sounds like something that might be a lot more at home in Nazi Germany or some other culture that devalues life, but how does it happen here? When I was a graduate student, I was working on a dissertation on Alfred Kinsey, which became my second book. I wrote my second book first. And I was in the National Archives. This was 1970, or I guess with your generation, I should say circa 1970. And I was plowing through Record Group 90, which contains the records of the United States Public Health Service's Division of Venereal Diseases. That record group has 420-something letter boxes, each stuffed to the gills with hundreds of documents. And I'm looking at stuff, and all the stuff I'm seeing deals either with the prophylaxis of syphilis or the treatment of syphilis. Except I come across a cache of documents, about 4 letter boxes, several thousand documents, that deal with this untreated syphilis program in Macon County, Alabama. So I start reading the stuff and my jaw drops. I thought, what is going on here? These people are sick and they're not being treated, and it looks to me like they're being lied to. What's going on? But, dutiful graduate student that I was, I did not pursue it. I was, after all, in an archive, and I thought all of this material was in the Mort Main, of the past. I didn't know that it was still alive. When I do archival research, I always carry 3x5 note cards in my pocket. And if I see a topic that I think is interesting, I jot down the citation and the location that I can find the stuff. So Tuskegee did warrant a note card in my pocket. So fast forward, it's 2 years later. I finished my dissertation. There are no academic jobs. I luck out, just outlandishly, and I get this postdoc to go to Harvard and study bioethics, this new field in the history of medicine. I'm driving across country, and Jean Heller of the Associated Press breaks the story of Tuskegee. In 4 hard-hitting articles, she exposes the basic facts of the case. The country's outraged. They can't believe this happens here. I have this light bulb go off over my head. I said, geez, I saw that stuff 2 years ago. Why didn't I stop it? Why didn't I have enough gumption to see if it was still going on? So when I get to Cambridge, I go to the people who are the director of the program that gave me my fellowship, and I say, I know you gave me the money to do this, but I want to do that. I want to work on Tuskegee. And it's clear to me in 3 seconds they don't care what I do as long as I get out of their office. I learned a very important lesson then, that a postdoctoral fellow and a chaired professor, the relationship between them is roughly that between a dog and a fire hydrant, okay? That's the truth. So, but Harvard that year gave me exactly what I needed. They gave me love and a roof and a stipend and freedom. So my challenge then was to get to work and see what I could find out. The challenge was made harder by the fact that the Justice Department issued an order within days of Jean Heller's articles telling the National Archives to sequester all materials because they were going to conduct an investigation. This was Richard Milhouse Nixon's Justice Department. And to put it bluntly, I did not trust them. I did not trust them to keep the documents. I thought that they would be deep-sixed. I didn't think the study would ever see the light of day. I was very fortunate because I had a dear friend in the National Archives, and I never give this talk without paying obeisance and thanking him. He's long since dead, but he was an important person in my life. His name was Albert Leisinger, Jr. And Al Leisinger was the Deputy Archivist of the United States. If he had a different personality, he would have been the Archivist of the United States. But he was the guy who got the work done. And for whatever reason, when I was a kid working in those archives, Al took a shine to me. He liked me, and he kind of took me under his wing, and I could always count on him for support. So I called Leisinger from Cambridge, and I said, I want to come work on Tuskegee, and I want your help. And Al said, well, two things. He said, you know that we're under an order from the Justice Department not to release those documents to anyone but them. I said, yeah, I've read that. And he said, the second issue is we can't find them. He said, since you worked here 2 years ago, all that stuff was moved out to Suitland, Maryland, to the Federal Records Center. And, there must be some chaos because we've had guys looking for it for several days now and we can't find it. So I say to him, well, can I come and can I look and will you help me and, blah, blah. And he says, let me think about it. So a couple of hours later, my phone rings, he calls me back. He said, okay, Jim, the fix is in. I've called the guys out of Suitland, Maryland, where the Federal Records Center is. He says, they're all my boys. I trained every damn one of them. He said, and they're going to shoot you under the radar. They're going to let you go back in the stacks. No one gets to go in the stacks in the National Archives. This is really cool. I mean, you can't imagine how cool this is. So he said, they're going to let you go in, and you're going to see if you can find them. And if you find them, they're going to, at my request, make copies of every document, and they will put a stamp of the National Archives on them, and they will be admissible in a court of law. Which means that if the Justice Department happens to lose them later, you'll have this shadow record, and you'll be able to help somebody, understand what happened in Tuskegee. So I hop in my car, I drive from Cambridge down to, D.C. I stay in a boarding house on Capitol Hill, $3 a night. How can you beat it? And it takes a couple of weeks. But I finally figure out the pattern of the shipwreck, how these records got screwed up and put in different boxes. And when the epiphany occurs, I start reassembling the records. And I have 4 boxes of all the stuff to begin the study. That never would have happened without Albert Leisinger, Jr., which is why I always thank him, even though he's in the grave. All right. So my challenge then was to get to work and see what I could make sense of. I had preconceived notions. My preconceived notion is that this would be a simple morality play. I would have doctors with blood dripping from their fangs. They would be evil incarnate. They'd be racist pigs out to do harm to defenseless, trusting African Americans, and that would be the show. Okay. The problem is that facts get in the way. I wasn't smart enough to invent alternative facts, like we're seeing today. So I was sort of stuck with the facts that I had. When I went to work and things started to come together, there was certainly evil in this study, and I'm not bleaching it out, but it's a more complicated matrix, okay? It's a more complicated fabric. Tuskegee comes out of an urge to do good. That's the first thing that kind of surprises me. It's a product, really, of the residue, the afterthoughts of the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era is this remarkable period of reform from like 1890 to 1920, in which Americans sort of stop and look at what's been happening. They've just gone through a furious period of nation building. Cities are formed, immigration changes the whole demographic complexion of the country, industrialization makes it Hamilton's America and not Jefferson's. So you've got industries, cities, immigrants, you've got a very fastly transformed country. The progressives sort of looked at that and said, okay, let's take stock and let's see what was gained and what was lost and what we need to change. And so they pass a number of things trying to basically humanize capitalism. They adopt some child labor laws. They put some regulations on industry like antitrust acts. Women start to agitate in the Progressive Era for their rights, and they gain momentum. One of those subsets is race. And race is a really difficult issue. It's always been the crucible of our society. And what makes it difficult is that things are awful. At the turn of the century, say 1900, the United States' race relations are at their nadir. Lynch law, okay, is what rules in the South. Jim Crow is the only social system, economic, political system of the South. African Americans are horribly discriminated against. They are reduced to, all they essentially lose with freedom is their chains. They are reduced through the crop lien system, sharecropping, peonage. They're reduced really to subsistence laborers who can't, basically leave their farms as sharecroppers, most of them. The pushback, okay, begins in the Progressive Era with organizations like the Urban League, okay, organizations formed like the NAACP, and they start the long process of trying to get equal rights for African Americans. Okay, as part of this spotlight on race, there are efforts to do something about health, because the issue is raised very, very quickly and very sharply that disease germs are really democratic. They cross boundaries. They don't stay on their side of the tracks. So if you want to do something about white health, you better also do something about African American health, because you can't have one part of the population left out of public health initiatives. So Booker T. Washington is one of the driving forces. He organizes something called National Negro Health Week. It's basically an effort to spotlight the health challenges of African Americans. And as a result, really, of this new sensibility about the prospect of change and things getting maybe a little bit better, one of the other big forces of the Progressive Era comes into play, and that's philanthropy. As a historian, I'm very convinced that I can't write much about the 20th century, about health or about science, without knowing a hell of a lot about the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the Rosenwald Fund, these philanthropic groups that created the critical mass of money necessary to push science down the road, to create public health initiatives. This is all before your time, you don't know it. But pellagra was a huge, huge public health problem. Hookworm, another huge, huge public health problem. And without the Rockefeller money and their campaigns, they'd still be huge public health problems. Well, it's against this backdrop of progressivism, forward thinking, maybe we can do something to help improve, that the immediate background of Tuskegee comes into focus. There's a foundation called the Julius Rosenwald Fund. It's named after its founder, Julius Rosenwald. He made his money in Sears and Roebuck. Okay, he was one of the driving forces in creating this big mail-order company. And it made him a very wealthy man. Because his people were Jewish, I think he had a soft spot in his heart for underdogs. Anti-Semitism was a big problem in America in the 19th century, as it is in still a few places today. So Rosenwald, I think, decided very early that he would try to help African Americans. And most of his money went into building schools, went into building little red brick schools all over the South. Why schools? Because Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision of the 1890s, had decreed separate but equal, that black children would go to segregated schools, white children would go to white schools, but they'd be equal. Well, that was nonsense. The black schools were underfunded, they were understaffed, they were chronically short on everything they needed to offer children an education. So Rosenwald decided that he would do something with his fortune to abate that, and he built schools, and that was part of it. But he was also vulnerable to the argument that a child sitting in a classroom has a difficulty reading if they can't be healthy, if they're not getting enough to eat, that there are issues that transcend education that you have to address in order for kids to take advantage of education, to be prepared for it. So he decides that he's going to put some money into African American health, and he creates a health division of his foundation that's modeled after really the health division of the Rockefeller Foundation, but on a much smaller scale. He doesn't know anything about African American health, so he talks with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington says, well, okay, let's get the professionals involved, and the professionals in this case are the Public Health Service. They go to the Public Health Service and they talk. The person who does the talking is this guy who's hired to be the head of the division, and it's Michael M. Davis. Michael M. Davis is a white guy. He's from Boston. If you know the history of medicine, you know that he was critical in developing the dispensary movement in Boston. He was always on the side in the 20s and 30s, well into the 40s, of trying to get national health insurance, single carrier. He was a chronic do-gooder, but he didn't know anything really about the issues facing blacks in the South. So he had the idea that, okay, we'll go to the Public Health Service, we'll ask them how best can we spend our dollars. As it happened, the person they talked with was a guy named, this is going to be your first slide, Tolliver Clark. Tolliver Clark was the director of the Division of Venereal Diseases of the United States Public Health Service. That was his position. The way the PHS was organized in those days was it was organized around disease models. There was, a division that did tuberculosis. There was a division that did TB, pellagra. There was a division that did, you name the pneumonia. And all those division directors would have told you to the person, if you asked them, what's the most important disease facing America? They would have said mine. So that's what Clark says. He says the most important disease facing blacks in the South is syphilis. And if you can put some money in that, you'll strike hammer blows for better health for African Americans. So Michael M. Davis buys it. He says, let's do it. And what they do is they choose 6 different southern states, 6 different communities within those states. Those communities are chosen on the basis of presenting a different socioeconomic profile or demographic profile. At one end of the continuum is Albemarle County in Virginia. In Albemarle County, there's a public health clinic. The African Americans there do pretty well. They get, they can afford, to see somebody because it's cheap. The other end of the continuum is Tuskegee, Alabama, Macon County, Alabama. Macon County, Alabama is dirt poor. It has facilities, but people don't have access to them, okay? So you're looking at a pristine population that goes from cradle to grave, literally, without seeing a physician. They live outside of modern medicine. So what the Rosenwald Fund does is it sponsors syphilis control demonstrations. And the way they work is they go into each of these 6 communities. They go in with a Wasserman dragnet. They test the people randomly, and they put together a sample, and they get a baseline incidence for how much syphilis there is there, okay? Then after they put together their syphilitic group, they come right back in with rapid schedule treatment for those same people. They give them the treatments of choice of that day. The arsenicals, arsphetamin, neo-arsphetamin, and mercury by inunction, loving mercury. Those demonstrations of bringing health care to people who have none go on for about a year and a quarter. And they yield wonderful results. One of the problems that medicine confronts is its own racism. If you read the scientific literature, the medical literature on blacks and syphilis going into these studies, it's a sorry tale. Chapter 2 of my book is entitled, quote, "A Notoriously Syphilis-Soaked Race," okay? That's why it's called blacks. And if you read that chapter, you'll see at work a very harsh mindset that frames beautifully the notion of blaming victims, okay? What they say is that African Americans cannot be cured of syphilis. And the reason they cannot be cured of syphilis is, one, they have libidos they cannot control. They just, fornicate like bunnies, and you can't do a damn thing about it because that's just who they are. They're libidinous, rutting beasts of the field. That's the portrait. The second thing they say is they're too stupid to come in for treatment. You can't get them to complete a regimen of treatment because they don't give a damn, about their health. They're too ignorant, they're too stupid, they can't be helped. Write them off, because disease may hold the ultimate solution to the race problem. Let them die, Okay, that's pretty much the mentality. So that's what Tolliver Clark and these guys are facing when they go in and treat these people, find out how much syphilis there is and treat them. The fact that they have success, that African Americans will be just as good a patients, okay, as white people if you explain what's involved and give them a chance to have treatment. The fact that they're able to do this is huge. They write these articles. Every one of those 6 southern states produces an article about their experience. And what they say in the article is, we came in, we saw how much syphilis there was, and we treated them, and they came back for treatment, and this is a huge success. That's what they argue. So it's a clarion call to the states, the southern states, to appropriate money and do what the Rosenwald Fund showed them you could do. It's, it's a happy story, and it's a story that, comes from goodness, wanting to do good. Those studies are interesting, the way they frame the relationship between socioeconomic conditions and health. Albemarle County, which is, I've already said, had a pretty good public health system and was more prosperous. Okay, there they find that the syphilitic group is about 6%. About 6% of the African Americans they test there have syphilis. That figure compares not unfavorably with national estimates for the white population. So it's an interesting figure. At the other extreme, though, is Macon County, Alabama. And there they find that 35% of the people tested have syphilitic, more than a third. But what's really interesting, quite apart from that astounding number, is that 62% of that 35%, more than half of those people, had congenital syphilis. They did not get it through venereal contact. The disease had largely lost its venereal quality and had become one of many endemic diseases. If you tested that same population for TB, you would have found an awful TB rate, because what you were looking at, again, was a pristine population that lived outside of medical care. All right. The hope is that the southern states will pick up the ball and run with it now, that they'll appropriate stuff. The hope is that the Rosenwald Fund may be able to do a little more. But what intervenes instead is the Great Depression. The year is now 1929. The bottom falls out of the American economy. The stock market is in shambles. People die, blow their brains out because they've lost their fortunes. And the Rosenwald Fund decides that basically the problem of public health is really too big for it to continue to try to, do on its own. So it terminates the Rosenwald Fund syphilis control demonstrations. This man, though, decides that he's going to take that foundation and build something on it that's going to go in a different direction. He decides that he's going to study untreated syphilis. Now, why would he do that? Okay, he wants to do it for a couple of reasons. Part of racial medicine, part of the racist thinking in medicine, was that syphilis in black people was fundamentally a different disease than syphilis in white people. That the fact that African Americans had different, genetic endowments, constitutions, changed the way they responded to the illness. In fact, many white doctors said that, syphilis is no big deal for blacks. They've had it so long, the population has been seasoned by the disease. It's kind of a trifling incident in their lives. Why treat it? Tolliver Clark knew better. Clark knew that it was a killer. And one of the things he wanted to show by studying untreated syphilis, there's an irony here, a delicious irony. He wanted to show that it was a killing disease so that it would be treated. So what begins as a study of untreated syphilis has this kind of, interesting kicker there. It's not as simple as you think. He wants to do good. The second thing, though, is that there had been a study of untreated syphilis in Scandinavia, the Oslo study. It was done on Caucasians. Clark wanted to create a black counterpoint to that study. He wanted to study syphilis in black people to test the notion of whether or not it was fundamentally a different disease in the two people. At the time, the difference that they thought was most important was that syphilis in black people in the tertiary stage, in the final stage, was more likely to attack the cardiovascular system. In white people, the argument went, it was more likely to attack the neural system. Now, that's a fascinating idea. And I kind of wondered where it came from when I kept seeing it in the literature over and over and over again. Historians love, we're gardeners at bottom. We want to scratch around and find the roots of things, So I finally found this article in 1864 written by a guy named Taylor in Virginia. And one of the great traditions in the history of medicine is that doctors write up cases, and they write up, very careful clinical reports on what they see. Well, this doctor had a black sharecropper who had syphilis and who developed a huge luetic aneurysm where it attacked his heart. And his explanation for this was that, black people are, big and strong and they have muscles and they have big hearts because they're chopping cotton all the day. So there's this crude reductionism at work that African Americans' hearts get attacked because of all the physical labor they do in the oversized and enlarged heart. I read this and I say, really? You guys bought that? Well, so what's the argument going to be for whites? Whites have big brains, right? Smart, white, big brain. Homo smarty, smarty, No, seriously. It's crude reductionism, the size of the organ. They thought white people had bigger brains and black people had bigger hearts, ergo the white brain and the black heart were bigger targets for spirochetes. Doesn't sound, plausible, but there it is. Deal with it. Clark wants to see whether syphilis does attack the cardiovascular system more in blacks. So what he decides is that he's going to go back to Tuskegee because that's where he found the highest incidence of syphilis, and that's where it's going to be the easiest to put together a study group. But he also knows that to do it, he's going to have to, tell some lies. If you tell people that you're there to study them and not to help them, are they going to, want to be in your study group? Probably not, especially since you've just been there treating people. So what's Clark going to tell them? He's going to tell them that we're coming back and this is a continuation of the Rosenwald Fund treatment program. He's going to, and did, lie fluently, lie fluently. Now, to make this lie believed, he needs partners. He needs support. So he goes to the Tuskegee Institute that Booker T. Washington founded. Booker T. Washington was dead by this time. The new principal of the institute was Robert Russo Moton. And he goes to him and he explains that he wants to come back and study untreated syphilis in black people, that it's going to be a very elegant, important scientific study that showcases this health problem for blacks, that science is going to benefit, that ultimately African Americans are going to benefit from the knowledge, and that it's going to be good science. And he needs his cooperation in getting people to step forward and be in the study. He also needs their cooperation, though, because he needs a clinic. He needs clinical facilities. So at the Tuskegee Institute, there's something called the John Andrew Hospital. It has all the gear he needs, all the medical apparatus he needs to conduct the experiment. All he needs is access to the facility and to the staff, and Booker T. Washington signs off. Robert Russo Moton signs off. The black physician who helps him there is a guy named Eugene Dibble. He's the head of the hospital, and Dibble is critical in getting the study off the ground. Now, I'm going to pause for a second and show you a couple of slides because I want you to see what we're talking about, what kind of area this is. This is our guy who is going to start the study. Where he's going to start it is Macon County. I've made references to the fact that it was poor. Let's look. Okay, this is classic Southern shotgun architecture. Cotton going right up to the side of the house, no gardens. There's another sharecropper shack. Okay, there's a sharecropper. There's a sharecropper. All of these photographs, by the way, I'm outrageously lucky. All of these photographs are from 1932 when the experiment begins, and they're all from Macon County, Alabama. I got them from Shadow of the Shadow of the Plantation by Charles Johnson, the famous black sociologist. He went in there as part of the Rosenwald Fund study to study health. Okay, look at that guy. Who is more emaciated, you know, the mule or the man? I mean, these people are starving. Okay. These are your prime targets. Okay, these are the guys they want to get in the study. All right. The people who are sent down to do the study are two individuals, O.C. Winger, Oliver Clarence Winger, and this guy, Raymond von der Leer. They are sent into Alabama to tell the black people that the Rosenwald Fund with Public Health Service assistance has come back now to treat more people who have syphilis. They're there to help them. Instead, they have no intention of treating, but something kind of ironic, again, irony comes in, happens. The state health officer, who's a guy by the name of Baker, tells Tolliver Clark that if you're coming back to my state and you want to study these people in my state and they have a communicable disease, you've got to treat them. You can't just leave them untreated, not on my watch. So Clark all but blows his stack. He says, Jesus Christ, it never occurred to me I'd have to treat anybody to do this damn study. You know, what's going on here? You're holding a gun to my head. So he doesn't like it at all, but he agrees to give the men as little treatment as he can possibly get by with. So when they put together the study group, when they go out and they lie to the people, and they tell them, we're here to help you and come in and you'll get your treatment, at the beginning, they do. They're given anywhere from 1 or 2 mercury rubs to 2 or 3 shots of neoarsphetamin, just enough to get the state health officer off their back, just enough to satisfy, you know, that requirement. Not enough at all to cure the disease. It would have taken a year of treatment, in some cases longer, to cure the disease, but more than enough to render this study completely bogus. Always in the literature on this study, it will present itself as a history of untreated syphilis, a scientific study of untreated syphilis in the African American male. The fact that the men got any treatment means that the experiment was, from the outset, contaminated. Having a little treatment is like being a little pregnant. It just doesn't wash, folks. It just doesn't wash. As a study of the consequences of undertreated syphilis, there's something to talk about. As a study of the consequences of untreated syphilis, we are putting our hands on our wallets, folks, because we're in the presence of people who aren't telling the truth, okay? This is contaminated, bogus, bad science from the beginning, but that doesn't keep it from going forward. Tolliver Clark and Raymond von der Leer and O.C. Winger spend about 6 months kind of studying the first group they put together. That's syphilitics. And as they study those men, Raymond von der Leer in particular becomes mesmerized, absolutely mesmerized by pathology. He sees these men, he thinks he is seeing great validation for cardiovascular syphilis at a very high incidence in 3rd stage syphilitic blacks, okay? In fact, one of his phrases, and this is a chapter title, a perfect gold mine of cardiovascular syphilis is what he calls it. He thinks he's absolutely, you know, finding rich, important material. So Tolliver Clark, after about 8 months, decides to pull the plug on Tuskegee. They found enough stuff to be interesting. There's enough stuff to write up some articles. You know, as far as he's concerned, they're done. So he calls von der Leer and O.C. Winger home. He said, that's it. This, you know, experiment's over. Von der Leer in particular says, no, man, if we've learned this much in 8 months, how much could we learn if we kept the experiment going? Come on, don't pull the plug. This is good stuff. You know, don't do it. Clark says, shut up, go to your room. I'm the boss, you know. The experiment's over. Then something happens. Tolliver Clark, long in the tooth, retires. And guess who succeeds him as the director of the Division of Venereal Diseases of the United States Public Health Service? Oh, I knew you were smart just looking at your faces. It's Raymond von der Leer. Now, I'm kind of beating hard on this because I want to make a point. One of the questions people will ask me, and they ask themselves, how can a study go on for 40 years? Jesus, I mean, how can it go on for 40 years? A good part of the explanation is that the United States Public Health Service promotes from within. So what we're going to see over the next 40 years is a well-fashioned career ladder in which officers, as young pups, go down to Tuskegee and work with the experiment. They get promoted, and before long, they're the division director. And when they're the division director, they're going to walk over, they're going to open that filing cabinet, they're going to look at the articles they're publishing on Tuskegee, and they'll say, oh, God, yeah, Tuskegee. I was down there in 1937. I remember those men. I remember the work I did. That's great science. This is the real deal, folks. Let's keep it going. So, in effect, Tuskegee doesn't get new eyes on it. It doesn't get seen through a different perspective. Everyone who sees it has been co-opted by familiarity. They know it, they love it, they embrace it. Why change it, okay? So if you want to know why it cranks for 40 years, folks, it's the same people going through their careers who are committed to it and see no reason to change it because no one has rocked the boat, okay? So the Tuskegee study, once Raymond von der Leer becomes the director, now has a lease on life. It's open-ended. We don't know how long it's going to last. No one is going to say at the beginning it's going to last 40 years or until there's a whistleblower, but what is clear is that it has friends in high places, and it has no natural enemies, and so it's going to be a wonderful example of inertia, something in motion, not being acted upon by an outside force. It's going to keep going. It's going to keep pushing down that road. All right. For it to work, certain things have to happen. Certain things have to keep it going. Eugene Dibble, this is the African-American director of the Andrew Hospital, where they're going to take the men in to examine them, and then when they have autopsies, they'll take them there for the autopsies. This is the linchpin figure in many ways of the experiment. Her name is Eunice Rivers, Nurse Rivers. She married late in life and became Eunice Rivers Lowry. And when she married late in life, she married one of the controls, by the way, one of the men who didn't have syphilis. Eunice Rivers is the nurse that serves as the bridge between the white doctors, okay, and the black patients, or the black subjects. They're not patients anymore. They're not being treated. Or she's a buffer. There are so many metaphors you can use to describe her. You can also think of her as a Judas goat, okay. When I wrote Bad Blood, she's the only person to whom I devote an entire chapter. And a friend of mine who's an African-American historian called me after the book came out and just reamed me, just absolutely, tore me a new one. He says, the trouble with you, Jones, is that you're a goddamn Southern liberal, and you don't know evil when you see it. That bitch was evil. And you're temporizing, and you're trying to create some kind of a context that creates some kind of, understanding for this woman. So I said back to my friend, all right, one person, one vote. You called it that way. I'm not going to call it that way, okay? I'm going to lay out this person's life, and I'm going to trust my readers, to reach their own judgment. You've rendered one verdict, one man, one vote, okay, She's complicated. She's complicated. The chapter title for her is The Joy of My Life. Okay, all of my chapter titles are direct quotes from primary documents because I try to capture the essence of the chapter with, one quote. She said that in the context. She said, oh, Dr. Jones, when I worked with those men, that was the joy of my life. And she meant it. She absolutely meant it. Now, how do you deceive people? How do you keep them from getting treatment? There's one, well, I'll say that. But anyway, her job is when the government doctors come back to examine the men, they come back once a year for the next 40 years, and they conduct their nomenclature, not mine, quote, annual roundups. That's what they call them. They bring the men in, they examine them, they see what the progress of the disease is, then they have no further interest in them until they die and they bring them in for autopsies. Okay. To keep them thinking that they get treatment, they give them aspirin and iron tonic. They tell them, take this tonic and you'll feel healthy as a mule. That's exactly what they say to them. With the aspirin, it's a miracle drug. It helps with their aches and pains. They haven't any other medicine. They take those aspirin, they think they're in tall cotton. They think they've been helped. Okay, so every year they get their ration of iron tonic and aspirin, and they think they're being treated. And Nurse Rivers' job is to go out and pick them up, drive them in, bring them to the clinic, or sometimes, let's do some other, this is part of the lie, by the way. When they're putting together the study group, what do they say in the document? Last chance for special free treatment. That's one of the documents I thought you should see. A photograph's worth 1,000 words. People think that Tuskegee is a simple morality play, black versus white, okay? And it's all white people and no black people involved. All right, look at the faces. The gentleman in the middle there, the African-American, is Peters, Dr. Peters. He's a pathologist at the Veterans Hospital. There's Nurse Rivers, there's a bunch of the white guys. When they didn't bring them in, they would assemble them at different meeting places in the hinterland, places with names like Warrior Stand, places you can't imagine how small they are, just wide places in the road. Or they'll stop them on the side of the road. There's Nurse Rivers. Now, what they're after here, you'll see it in a moment, is a venipuncture, is a blood sample. There they're getting it. They'll thank the man, and that'll be it. On to the next one. There she's giving him his iron tonic and his aspirin, okay? Telling him that those things will help him. This guy thinks that spirochetes are, in the tertiary stage, are very likely to attack eye tissue, and so he's zeroing in on eyes. Here they're doing x-rays. I'm going to show you only one photograph that is upsetting. I could show you a lot more, but I want you to see what we're talking about, okay? Not this one. They're after the cardiovascular syphilis, but this one, there's a spinal tap. All the men were tricked into having spinal taps. They had no local anesthesia. Some of them had very severe headaches from these lumbar punctures. That's a 20-gauge needle. There, okay? That's ulcerated cutaneous syphilis. I could show you photographs of it on their faces, okay? I could show you photographs of men who have luetic aneurysms with bulging in their chest that look like grapefruits that are about to burst, and sooner or later they do. But this is what's happening, okay? This is not a pretty story. It's not a story that's hidden. In the 40-year history of the experiment, 14 scientific papers will be published in refereed medical journals, some of them very prominent. At no point is it surreptitious. At no point is it sub rosa, hidden. The medical fraternity knows exactly what they're doing. There are sessions on these at medical conventions with big graphs and charts, and everyone knows what's coming down. And they all begin the same way. Untreated syphilis in the male Negro. Okay, and it's just year after year after year of them, okay? Now, the experiment goes forward of its own momentum, 40 years. I like to envision that there were opportunities for the Public Health Service to change directions, to see what they were doing was wrong. The first opportunity that happens is in 1937. The experiment begins in 32. In 1937, there's a new Surgeon General of the United States. His name is Thomas Perrin. And Thomas Perrin, who had been the director at one point of the division and had been the director of public health in New York, parent is a syphilis man. He thinks syphilis is a horrible disease. He writes a book on it. He gets thrown off radio because he uses the word syphilis on a CBS radio show in 1934. But what he wants to do is to build on the Rosenwald Fund demonstrations. So in 1937, he sends out public health service officers again, but on the federal dime, and he puts them all in the southern small communities out in the rural hinterland, and he puts in mobile clinics, and he treats the guys and the gals who have syphilis. However, when those mobile clinics come to Alabama, and they come to the counties where the Tuskegee study is being conducted, Nurse Rivers goes with them. And men will line up to get tested and treated, and Nurse Rivers will say, don't treat that man, don't treat that man, don't treat that man, don't treat that man, because they're in the study, and they're not to have treatment. This is a qualitative change, okay? Up until 1937, I can make a really good historical argument that the men were in no danger of being treated, okay? They couldn't afford it. There were no doctors. They lived outside of modern medicine. But that changes in 1937 because those men would have been treated on the United States Public Health Services program, or in it. This takes a de facto situation that had been placed under a microscope for scientific observation, and it transforms it into the active fact of denying treatment that would have been forthcoming. That's the first time they had a chance to rethink it, and they didn't. The second chance they had was World War II. When World War II breaks out, about 1/3 of the men are young enough still that they would have been inducted into the armed services. And as part of that induction, they would have had physicals, and if they had been found to have syphilis, they would have been treated and rendered fit to fight, just as other men were who were drafted or joined the military service. What happens instead is that the United States Surgeon General writes the draft boards of the men in Russell County, Tallapoosa County, Bullock County, Macon County, gives them a list of the subjects and says, do not draft these men. They are already serving their country. They are soldiers of science. Okay, second opportunity by the boards. Doesn't happen. The men get deferred, they don't get treated. Next opportunity, 1943, 2 years later, Alabama passes something called the Henderson Act, and it is a model public health program that requires people who have a communicable disease to be treated by the state at the state's expense. It's not applied to these people. Another opportunity lost. What else happens in World War II? Penicillin. Suddenly you've got a drug now that really is a magic bullet, okay? It doesn't take a year and a half. You can treat folks with penicillin and kill those spirochetes toot sweet. They never get it. The person who's in charge of the division in 1943, 44, 45, 46, 47 is John R. Heller, Rod Heller. Heller, in 1932, was sent there when he was a much younger man to put together the control group. So he knew all about Tuskegee. He's an example of my guys being promoted, okay, and being familiar and not thinking anything was wrong. When I interviewed Dr. Heller, I asked him, did you guys ever talk about, giving the men penicillin? And he said, no. I said, well, at the risk of belaboring the obvious, why didn't you? And he said it just as deadpan as I'm about to. It would have ended the experiment. Okay, so he saw no moral conflict, no moral quandary whatsoever. That's just the way it was. It was also on his watch that another opportunity to rethink Tuskegee came. Nuremberg, the Nuremberg trials. When the world learned of the atrocities Nazi doctors committed experimenting on helpless people, Jews, gypsies, people who had handicaps, The revulsion was so powerful that people resolved not to let that happen again. So the Nuremberg Code was promulgated, and it was supposed to prevent that kind of horrific miscarriage of justice and scientific bankruptcy. I asked John Heller, did you guys ever talk about Tuskegee in the light of Nuremberg? He said, no, we didn't make that association. Okay, next opportunity that's going to be missed. In the early 1950s, the civil rights movement begins. We usually locate that beginning with Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama. The next year, Martin Luther King will lead the Montgomery bus boycott. There will be national publicity on civil rights, and there'll be the largest people's uprising since the American Revolution. White folks don't do it. White folks are, sort of tangentially involved. The people's uprising is conducted, led by, and triumphs by black people who finally demand their rights. It takes a long time and it's a bloody road, but they won't take no for an answer. They pay the price, they stay the course, they fight discrimination, they earn equal rights finally with national legislation, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of the mid-60s. Heller, by the way, let me make one more comment before I leave him. People sometimes get the impression that the people who conduct the Tuskegee study are kind of nobodies. Who cares? Who are they? John Heller, when he left the Division of Venereal Diseases in 1948, became the first director of the National Cancer Institute. In 1965, he became the head of Sloan Kettering. He is not a nobody. He's a first magnitude public health person. And the fact that he has no problems with Tuskegee is scary, okay? It's just plain scary. All right, when the civil rights movement erupts, Montgomery, Alabama is 35 miles from Tuskegee, and it's the epicenter. Montgomery's the epicenter. You would think that the people conducting the experiment would say, whoa, wait a second, we've got a problem down there in Tuskegee. This doesn't look good in terms of the changes that our country seems to be undertaking right now, being forced to undertake. And it does have an effect, because I can show you, and I cite in my book, examples of doctors saying, well, maybe we shouldn't publish that article right now. Maybe this is not a good time. Maybe we ought to just kind of keep it cool for a little while and let this thing kind of settle down, shake out, and not call attention to what we're doing in Alabama. They see it as a political problem, They do not frame it as a moral issue. There's no epiphany here that what they're doing is wrong. So they kind of adjust their timing, they delay articles, they pussyfoot around the situation. The experiment would still be going on years later. Oh, by the way, after 25 years, they gave the guys $25 and a certificate of thank you. There it is. Okay. The experiment would still be going on, I think, if it were not for this man on the right. Let's showcase him, Peter Buxton. He's our hero. He's our whistleblower. What happens is that Peter works at the Hunt Street Clinic in San Francisco as a, epidemiologist, follow-up worker. His job is to talk with people who have syphilis, get their partners' names, get them all in for treatment. As part of his education, he's taking graduate courses, and he decides to do a paper. And the paper that he kind of stumbles on is Tuskegee. And he starts reading these articles and seeing what happened, and he can't believe it. It blows his mind. He cannot believe this is happening. So he goes to his professors, he goes to his boss, in the Hunt Street Clinic, and he raises hell. He just says, this is wrong, and we got to do something about it. Finally, Diogenes can stop. The lamp can stop here. We've got the honest man. We've got the person who recognizes evil when he sees it. So his boss tells him to, come on, you don't understand this. It's okay. He blows him off. Peter is a force of nature. He doesn't take no for an answer. It bothers him, and he acts upon it. It takes him more than a year and a half, but he writes letter after letter after letter. And he finally gets to the top of CDC, to the head guy. And every letter is the same. I'm concerned about this. All the good work we do can be blown away by the evil that we're doing. We've really got to rethink this. Come on, let's make it right. Finally, they fly Peter Buxton from San Francisco to Atlanta, Georgia, to the Center for Disease Control to meet with him to see who this crazy guy is who's just raising hell with him, who won't keep his mouth shut. They lock him in a room. I've been in that room because later we took depositions from those same guys there. They put him in this big room, and there are 13 of them, and they're one of him, and basically they beat the socks off him. They say, you're not a physician. You don't divine the mysteries. Where's your white coat, buddy? You're a social worker. Shut up. Shut up and go home. You're a do-gooder who doesn't know what you're talking about it, and we're MD, me doctor, see? Go home. So Peter goes home. The guy's been roughed up. But Peter being Peter, in a couple of weeks, ego rallies. And Peter writes an incredible letter back to CDC. And he said, yeah, right, I'm not a doctor. I don't divine the mysteries of medicine, but I know a moral problem when I see one. You have put in motion and are responsible for a conspiracy that systematically denied treatment for a treatable disease that is killing and has killed these men. And I don't know if a jury would talk murder one, but I think they might talk murder two. That got their attention. When they thought that there might be consequences, for what they were doing, they start to think more critically about it. So in 1969, they conduct the first review of the Tuskegee study, the first ethical review, they call it. Who conducts it? The people who conducted the study. They don't bring in any person of color. They don't bring in an ethicist. They don't bring in any outside talent with the exception, let me go back, with the exception of this gentleman. Gene Stollerman was on the faculty at Vanderbilt, was a very distinguished physician. He was the ringer. He was the one person who hadn't worked on the study. And at that meeting, he's the only one who objected to it morally. He's the only one who says, I think this is wrong, I think we ought to stop it, I think this is bad science, I think it's unethical, and they just basically shout him down. They don't listen to him. But Stollerman gets the vote for, trying to do the right thing. All right, the men are still trapped in this experiment. One of the things I didn't mention was that in addition to lying to the men, the Public Health Service actually sealed them in the experiment so they wouldn't get treatment. How did they do that? They went to each of the medical societies. They did it in Macon County and all the contiguous counties. They gave the local doctors lists of the men. And they said, if these guys come into your office, don't treat them for syphilis because they're in a scientific study and we want your cooperation and we want them left untreated. And that's what they did. All the medical societies signed off. They all helped. And with each one of those groups helping, another door closed, another door closed, another door closed, and finally, the men were hermetically sealed, cut off from treatment. So there's no chance that they're going to get it unless they move from Tuskegee and go someplace else. All right. When they conduct this review of the experiment, they have a chance then to end it. Instead, they say to each other, we owe it to the men who have died not to end the experiment until the last person dies. Science needs to get as much information as it can. So what they try to do is in 69, 70, 71, 72, they try to spiff up the science. They hire some more statisticians to massage the data. They get, they put more resources in it. They tell themselves that that's the proper response. They keep it going. They keep kicking it down the road. That's where it would have been had it not been for Peter Buxton. And Peter Buxton comes back into the story. After he met with them, he goes to law school. When he goes to law school, he tries to interest his professors in it. They say, harumph, young man, stirring up litigation? Why, the statute of liberty or the statute of limitations has long since run out. How are you going to get evidence? You're going to exhume bodies? How are you going to tell syphilis killed them and not tuberculosis? You haven't got a case. Finally, he dates a woman, an old girlfriend, whose name is Edie Lederer. Edie Lederer worked for the AP, the Associated Press, and she was the head of their Far Eastern office. I think she was maybe stationed in Manila or Tokyo, but anyways, somewhere in the East. She was back in San Francisco for some R&R, and she and Peter had a date, and Peter tells her about it. Well, this time he's told somebody who can do something and will do something. She can't believe it. So they go back to his apartment in North Beach on Telegraph Hill. They have Chinese food. They spread it out on the floor. They eat, Chinese food, and he keeps laying article after article after article on her. Published articles, it's all there. And she can't believe it. So she calls her boss at the AP, and she says, boy, have I got a story. I'm going to run with it. And he says, no, you're not. You're going back to the Far East, and we're going to give this story to a reporter in the United States who knows the Washington beat, whose name is Gene Heller. Okay, now we've come full circle. Okay, now we've come full circle. Gene Heller learns about the experiment. She writes those 4 articles. The public can't believe it, and all hell breaks loose. Okay, all hell breaks loose. The Public Health Service is in the ridiculous position of saying, we did that? No, it was over there, it was over here, it was back somebody else. I didn't do it. What are you talking? You talking to me? I didn't do that. No, it was silly. They crawfished, they temporized, they told half-truths, half-lies. They tried to distance themselves in every way, but the can stayed tied to their tail. They couldn't get away from it. It happened. Facts matter. There were no alternative facts with which to defend themselves. Okay, so the public furor prompted the Public Health Service to end the Tuskegee study. Finally, 1972. But the story doesn't end there. First of all, what are you going to do for the subjects who are still alive? There's a class action suit. The person who brings that suit is this gentleman, Fred Gray. Fred is a giant. There's no other word for it. He is a giant in the history of civil rights in America. Fred was Rosa Parks' attorney in 1954. He was Martin Luther King's attorney for the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956. He has argued 13 cases before the Supreme Court, all dealing with civil rights, and he's won most of them. He is one of the strongest people you'll meet. When he was a young man, he's a deeply religious person. He's also an ordained minister of the Church of Christ. He's a fundamentalist ordained minister. And he has all the quiet confidence of a Christian holding 4 aces. That's who the guy is. Fred made a bargain with his Lord when he was a young man that when he got out of the service, he'd go to law school and he'd come back to Alabama. He couldn't go to law school in Alabama because they didn't admit black students at the University of Alabama, so he went to Case in Ohio. He comes back, and the deal he makes with his Lord is, if God gives me strength, I'm going to destroy everything in the state of Alabama that has segregation written on it. That was his mission. I'm going to destroy it. It's not going to be standing. He dedicated his life to that. He's still alive, by the way. Fred and I were on a program together 2 years ago. I would rather have a bear after me than Fred Gray. I'm serious. A bear might decide to eat somebody else. A bear might get tired, and go off another direction. Fred's going to eat you. Fred's going to eat you. So I had the privilege of working with him on the case. He was having difficulty finding evidence for the study. Every time he would file for disclosure, he would ask for documents. The Justice Department would write back saying, unable to locate. And that went on, that bullshit went on for years. So finally, I got in touch with him. I said, I've got documents. It's those same documents that our friend Albert Leisinger got me to have stamped, remember, with the seal of the archives, so they would be admissible in the court of law. So when I called Fred, the next day, he was in my home. He got there in a hurry. We said hello at the door. He spotted those 4 boxes of documents on my dining room table. There was a bowl of fruit next to them. I'll never forget it. Fred walks up, starts peeling the banana, starts eating, and says, let's get into the documents. So one of the joys of my life was getting to work with this good man and help him win an out-of-court settlement. Fred brought suit. The government didn't want to try the case. They had what attorneys call bad facts. You don't want to try cases you're going to lose. So he was able to get not as much money as he would have wanted, not as much money as I would have wanted, but some money for the subjects. He was also able to get for them treatment and lifetime health insurance paid for by the government, which has my vote for not a bad way to go for the country. Oops, well, that went out. Just a second. The story again, before I end, there is this settlement, and Tuskegee is at that point, the men are being treated. They have some compensation. The estates of people who died in the experiment get compensation, but Tuskegee doesn't go away. It does not go away. The problem with Tuskegee is that it shattered trust. It made African Americans very deeply suspicious that the government, that white doctors were not out to do them good, that there might be white doctors who do them harm. And so you got just a great deal of misgiving and hurt. And that's, you got to put this in historical context about why people would feel that way. African Americans looked at Tuskegee and they looked at it through a lens, of hundreds of years, not 40 years, not the experiment's life. That experience began with capture in Africa. It began with being put in chains, put on ships. Many of them will die in the horrors of the Middle Passage. They will then become chattel property in the South, slaves. They will stay slaves until the Emancipation Proclamation and the war, the Civil War, frees them. But then they don't get 40 acres and a mule. What they get is sharecropping, the crop lien system, peonage. They are systematically kept out of the market economy. They go to inferior schools. They can't vote. They are ostracized in an apartheid society of segregation, And when they think about Tuskegee, that record, historical record, is the lens through which they view it. It's just another example of whitey, of white people doing harm to black people. So of course they're hurt, and of course they're suspicious. When you shatter faith, it hurts. In the 1980s, a new mysterious disease came along. 81 was when it first surfaced, and that was HIV, it was AIDS. And as AIDS began to be formed and shaped into an epidemic, people were mystified about its origins, they were horrified by its consequences, they knew that we were in the throes of something terrible. And they looked for explanations. One explanation that gained some traction was that it was, and especially in the African American community, or specifically in the African American community, was that it was a white man's made in a laboratory disease for the explicit purpose of genocide against black people. Now you say, how can people think that? I mean, how can people, believe something? Well, when educated African Americans, doctors, lawyers made that argument, their proof that they fell back on was, well, if they did Tuskegee, what makes you think they wouldn't do this? Okay, once again, if you shatter trust, it has consequences. In the 1900s or in the 1990s, a group of us academics felt that there had never been a soul cleansing about Tuskegee, that more needed to be done. Specifically, what we wanted was a presidential apology to the African-American public. And a group of us worked, an ad hoc committee worked to encourage, i.e. pressure, President Clinton, William Jefferson Clinton, who likes to think of himself as the first African-American president, but we all know Obama is the real one. Okay. The upshot was that in 1997, Bill Clinton did issue a formal apology to all African Americans, to the entire American public, for the great wrong that was Tuskegee. And I attended that. Apology. That's Peter. There's Charles Pollard. He's at the apology. He's the spokesperson, by the way, for the. I got to interview Charlie. He was the spokesperson for the survivors of the experiment. He's a very, he's dead now, but he was a very dignified, strong, just good guy. And there's Herman Shaw. Could say the same thing about him. These are subjects who came to the presidential apology. There's a guy who's mugging it up who was happy to be there as well. Okay. With Tuskegee, just to wrap it up, if there's something that's good that's come of it, and I look with a nimble eye trying to find something good, it has to do with the regulatory state. It has to do with efforts to prevent it from happening again. After Tuskegee, Senator Edward Kennedy holds hearings, okay, that are focused on human experimentation. The centerpiece, the showpiece for that is the Tuskegee study. And what happens is that the government doctors come in and tell their stories. The men you just saw come in and tell their stories to the committee. And it doesn't take long to see who's sitting in their chair comfortably and telling the truth and who's squirming and crawfishing and looking like they'd rather be someplace else, okay? So when those two sides of the story are told, it doesn't take Congress long to figure out that one group had been harmed and another group had been the harmers. So in response to that, and some other things, but Tuskegee is clearly the impetus, the driving force. Congress passes the Human Subjects Act. And now at every institution that does research and receives any federal funding at all, which you might as well say all of them, there are something called IRBs, Institutional Review Boards. And they mandate that any study, treatment, it's a very broad net, has to pass muster with regard to not doing harm to the people who are going to be subjects or patients in that study or procedure or treatment, okay? That's Tuskegee, okay? That's one of the few things I can point to that I can say something good came out of it. Where we go from here, Tuskegee is, I think, receding in the memory of most Americans. We live in a 24-hour news cycle. We're bombarded every day with something new, some of it terrible, some of it nice. And it's very hard to keep in our heads something that happened, a long time ago. But we need to. We need to. Because if that trust is going to be restored, we need to, first of all, own up to what we did. We need to face it. And we need to say in a convincing way that we're not going to do it again. And if we can do that, maybe that too can be something that's good. Thank you.
And then copy of the book in the back. Dr. Jones has generously offered to sign the book.
There are cookies back there, folks. Don't leave empty-handed. Okay. Yeah. Excuse me? She knew everything. She knew everything. She knew everything. She knew everything. Okay.
Hi, fantastic talk, really enjoyed it. I'm a primary care doctor, and I can certainly attest to a lot of what you've said regarding distrust among African Americans, even among African American doctors. There's a lot of distrust, and many, many patients cite Tuskegee. I wanted to know whether or not you heard of the radiation experiments against African Americans in your studies. I only saw a very brief mention of it in a book I read, and I wondered if you were aware of those.
Yes, radiation studies. The question was about the radiation studies and whether I was familiar with them. There was a presidential apology for those studies. It precedes Tuskegee, and one of the reasons we thought that Tuskegee warranted an apology was that the radiation victims were apologized to. There's a historian whose name is Susan Lederer, okay, and she has written really good stuff on the radiation studies. She's a fine historian.
I'll add a little fact about that. The reason that you didn't actually see President Clinton's apology for the radiation studies, which, by the way, were chaired by Ruth Vaden, who is the former director of the Berman Institute of Bioethics at Johns Hopkins, is because the O.J. Simpson verdict was announced the very same hour as that apology, and so it got all of the press attention. But the radiation reports are in my office, and there are two or three documents that are about this thick that go through the entire history. They felt it, Ruth Vaden felt that it was very, very important to have a historian on the committee.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that talk. It was really fascinating. My background is in global health, and I participated in a lot of studies where I felt that there may be a mismatch between the framework that we're working with based on the Belmont Report for research in the United States and research that's initiated in high-income countries but being conducted in low-income countries. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, whether we have sufficient regulation and guidelines for research in poor countries.
Yeah. I mean, this too has a history, right? And I'll just cut to the chase. I do not favor anything being outsourced, being shipped abroad that isn't ethical to do at home. That's the short and the long of it. I don't believe in using third world populations that are vulnerable and at risk because of scarcity of health care or ignorance. I don't believe in trading upon that to test drugs or birth control measures, or, there's a long history of things that have been outsourced that we need to think hard about. Does that help, or does that answer your?
Yeah, well, I think, sometimes there's issues with informed consent.
Yep.
What we think of as appropriate informed consent that would pass an IRB at a U.S.-based institution is not necessarily appropriate informed consent that gives people the adequate information in the population where the research is going to be conducted. And also in terms of power relationships between people seeking health care and the healthcare providers who might be collaborating in research, there's a lot less opportunity for people to say no or feel like they have the opportunity to say no.
Correct.
And I'm wondering if we need different rules for how to address those discrepancies with the context in high-income countries and the context in low-income countries.
Right. All the points you made are good. All the points you made are good. The differential of knowledge and power that separates a subject and a primary investigator or other researchers is enormous. The language that is used can really skew the results. It can appear to be sufficiently informative as to satisfy the requirements of what some people would consider informed consent. But upon closer examination, it does not communicate, it does not convey all the complexity or the consequences or the possible outcomes. It's kind of an ideal, I think of it, a kind of mark that you'd like to be able to hit, and it's easier said than done. I've had people in Q&A like this say, well, wasn't it impossible to get informed consent, from the subjects because in the Tuskegee study, because they were ignorant, they were unlettered, and that question always pisses me off because I think with proper language you can convey anything. I've taught 7th and 8th graders, and I can teach them the same U.S. history that I did graduate students if I'm a good teacher, if I communicate clearly. It all turns on finding the right word choice and getting them to come back with an understanding that allows you to know that you've done the job of conveying what needs to be conveyed. So.
Do you have a sense of how, like in primary education, how much the Tuskegee experiment is in textbooks, say, for middle school, high school students, if at all? And I asked for a couple of reasons. One is because you said that you think we're losing some conscious of it. But second of all, it's clearly a story that's more known among the African American community's collective conscious than among others. And it seemed to be, if we more universally understood stories like this.
Right. Well, I'm gonna answer that at two levels. One specific and one more general. I can tell you one textbook in which it's discussed, because I'm the co-author of a textbook. I'm one of 5 authors of a U.S. freshman history survey that went through 7 editions and helped put my kids through college. So I wrote half of the 20th century in that textbook, and I have a feature article. And we had these, feature things that were supposed to be interest grabbers in the chapters. And on the chapter on the New Deal and the Great Depression, and then going into the New Deal, I have a segment on Tuskegee it's probably no more than 300 words, but it's there. Now, as to the broader question, is it receding into lost memory? And I think the answer is yes. There's a person who has studied this systematically. He and his students. There's a man named Ralph Katz, and Katz teaches at NYU. And he's an interesting guy. He's a dentist, okay? But he has a doctorate in epidemiology as well as dentistry. And he's done really wonderful work in the third world, most of it in Haiti, one of the poorest places on the planet, trying to promote dental health in societies that are chronically underserved with, by professional dentistry and the people who work with epidemic diseases that, involve oral hygiene. Ralph became, I think, struck by the Tuskegee study very early. And he has had his students do really kind of elegant studies, sampling studies. Being an epidemiologist, he knows how to put together samples. And he's published a book of essays, okay, that look at the legacy of the Tuskegee study in different communities. What he found most recently is that in the 80s, there's a pretty high recognition of it because the events are recent in the early 80s. There's a lot of discussion of it because my book comes out in 81, and that's one plateau. Then it kind of drops off. In 93, I think it was, I did a revised. I just added a chapter to Bad Blood, and there's another bump in recognition, and then it falls off. Now, according to his data, somewhere between, I think it's 15 and 18% of African Americans can tell you what Tuskegee was or have any idea about it. More than 80% do not. It has simply, fallen off. With white people, it's even less. If you say Tuskegee, they'll think, maybe about the Tuskegee Airmen, okay? But not the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So I think, in our circles, it's well known. But even in our circles, by the way, it's well known, but it's not always carefully known. I'm struck by the number of people who really don't know what they're talking about when they start talking about Tuskegee. I think that it is, as I say, fading, and has largely faded.
Again, thank you, great talk. So I have two questions. One is my own, one is someone else's. So I'll lead with the other person's question. Is probably a quicker answer for this one. Was any legal action taken against any of the perpetrators, regardless of aside from the class action lawsuit? And my other question was, we identified a problem, right? So do you have any thoughts on what you think are some next steps to remedying this mistrust between the African American community and science?
Okay, the first question I got clearly. The second question, I'm sorry, can you sharpen it? I didn't.
Yes. How do we begin to rebuild the trust? Sorry. How do we begin to rebuild the trust between science and the African American community? How do we begin to rebuild the trust? Yeah.
Okay. First question. Any consequences for anybody? No. No doctor loses a license. No doctor is called up before a review board. No doctor is dragged into court and has to defend what they did in court. The closest thing I can come to a consequence, and it's trivial, is that one of the physicians who was in charge of the study and worked on it a lot in the 1950s was a guy named Sidney Olansky. And he was a psephologist in Atlanta, Georgia, and was on the faculty for a while at Emory. And his sons both became physicians. And so I think the three of them endowed the rare book room in the library, medical library at Emory's medical school. Beautiful, paneled room with fancy, wooden panel and very, posh setting. When Sid Olansky's role became clear, Olansky was one of the doctors who was on Good Morning America with me. It's an interesting story. When the book came out, one of the producers at Good Morning America said, we'd like to have you on the show. We'd like to discuss your book. And I said, I'll do it under a couple of conditions. I said, one is I want Fred Gray. I want Fred Gray to be included. My second condition is I want subjects, men who were in the experiment, to be included. This is not the Jim Jones show, okay? This is, what I want you to do is put some government doctors on, put some of the subjects on the program, have Fred and me there, and then let folks sort it out whether they think it's a fair fight, okay? So that's what they did. And Sid Olansky was one of the doctors that agreed to be on the program and be interviewed on Good Morning America. And in the interview, he says, "Oh, I don't think we hurt them. I don't think we hurt them." And he says it just that kind of quizzically, "Oh, I don't think we hurt them." Well, after that, back at Emory, some of the African American students in the medical program rose up in rebellion, and they raised hell on campus. And the upshot was that they took his name off the rare book library. That's kind of a slap on the wrist. Must have been hard on his ego, but did it cost him his freedom? Did it cost him his license? Did it cost him his money? Did it cost him his honor? No. No, I'm not familiar. Now, your second question is how do you rebuild trust? And that's hard. I have a lesson I take away from Tuskegee, since we're talking now, and we are down to the noble remnants of the evening, just we brave few who are left. But when I think about Tuskegee, I think if it has an overpowering lesson, okay, it's that poor people, okay, who don't have health care, who don't have money to afford health care, are for sale really cheap. They're low-hanging fruit. They are so easy to deceive, so easy to rip off. All you got to do is lie to them, tell them you're helping them, and the good thing, and they want to believe you. They want to believe you. So I would like to see a medical system that doesn't leave people at risk. I have, as a medical historian, thought for a very, very long time that we need national health insurance. We need to cover everybody. It needs to be affordable. We don't leave people vulnerable so that they are so eager to have care that they'll do anything to get it, okay? So if I'm going to rebuild trust and stuff, I'd start with a healthcare system that takes care of people.